Tonight's is another true viewer story. It's called Weird Experiences in Southeastern Kentucky. It's about a plot of land that's been in a certain family ever since the 1790s. It started out as like a 1,200 acre plot, but over the years it's been whittled down, parceled out to now there's about 20 acres still in the family in southeastern Kentucky. But there's a few different stories about the property, and it reminds me of the ones I grew up on. So, without further ado, story one. My first time visiting the property was when I was 11 years old. My grandparents had never even told me we owned land in another state. It was just something that sort of popped out over a discussion at dinner one night randomly, and my grandfather shared that Aunt Katie had called and shared that a tree had come down in her yard and that our family friend who would usually help her was out of town. We packed up my grandparents' car and drove up to the property, and I met my Aunt Katie and got to see our family's land for the first time. Most of the property is heavily wooded. Only 1 to 3 acres have been clear cut so that the house and cemetery aren't crawling with critters and bugs. One evening, we were going to head back to town for dinner, and my grandfather asked me to walk through the house and make sure all the windows and doors were locked and that the curtains in every room were pulled shut because we'd be getting back after dark, and he didn't want to have to go around and shut them at night. I agreed, and as my family loaded up in the car and started slowly backing down the driveway, I went back into the house and started checking the window locks and trying the handles of all the doors. As I moved towards the back of the house, I started hearing what sounded like voices coming from one of the very back rooms. It kept getting louder as I continued down the main hallway, but I couldn't make out what the voices were saying. The best way I can describe is this. It's like when you're sitting in a restaurant talking to the person in front of you while people all around you are having their own conversations. You can tell that the other people are talking and you can hear them, but you're not actually listening to what they're saying. You just hear the noise. That's the closest I can get to what the voices sounded like to me. Finally, I came up to the last room I needed to check, the old funeral parlor. This is where the voices sounded the loudest. As soon as I stepped through the doorway, my entire body buzzed. It felt like I had pins and needles all over, and the voices I had been hearing stopped instantly. I had the feeling I was being watched by a large group of people, almost as if I had just done something embarrassing in front of a crowd that was now just awkwardly staring in my direction, judging my next moves. I slowly put my hands up in front of me in a I surrender kind of way, and I just walked backwards out of the old funeral parlor and down the hall. Once I got to the main living room, I booked it out the front door and all the way to my grandparents' car. I climbed into the back seat next to my Aunt Katie, who smiled at me and said I looked spooked. I didn't say anything about what I had heard at first, but later in the evening, when it was just my grandfather and I sitting down in the living room watching TV, I asked him what he thought. My grandfather listened to what I had to say and just shook his head while looking at his shoes. He told me that when he had lived on the property briefly as a young man, he had gotten spooked a few times, but that he had been told by his father that the things out here only have power if you give them power. He told me to push whatever thoughts or feelings I had out of my mind and try to ignore things if I ever heard or saw something out here again. I asked if he believed in ghosts or anything like that, and he told me that he didn't want to. He then asked me not to ask him about these things again because he didn't like to think about it. Story 2. A few years after my first visit to the property, I was staying over with my grandparents in our hometown down south of the Appalachians when one night, while we were up late watching the movie, my grandfather's phone rang. It was my Aunt Katie, and she sounded scared. She told my grandfather that someone was at the door to the funeral parlor again, and that they were just standing behind the door knocking every so often, not moving and not speaking. She could see them through the glass in the door, which was covered with a thin curtain, making their silhouette visible but not their face or any defining features. She shared that she had called 911 because the person behind the door wouldn't identify themselves despite her repeatedly asking who it was, and that the knocking had just continued. While on the phone with a local dispatcher, she had been disconnected, waiting for police to arrive. She had decided to call my grandfather to make sure her phone still worked and ended up staying on the phone with him until a deputy pulled up in the driveway. She had sat with her pew-pew aimed at the door, telling my grandfather that she was beyond scared and that this had been happening off and on for a while now. Eventually, a deputy arrived, and shortly after, they would hang up the phone. From what I've heard since, when Aunt Katie got up to go speak to the deputy, whatever was at the old funeral parlor door vanished. The cleared part of the property and some of the surrounding woods were searched, but nothing was found. Story 3. It's now been several years since my Aunt Katie passed away, and the property has been uninhabited the past 5 years since her passing. We go up to visit more frequently now to do maintenance, as there is no one to tell us if something is wrong or needs fixing. Our current plan is to do a controlled demolition of the house in the near future, as the past few years have resulted in a lot of weathering and deterioration. The old floors are now mushy, and 2 rooms have collapsed. The old wallpaper and ceiling are falling down slowly, and the roof of the house is beginning to cave in 2 spots. About 2 years ago, we met with a few contractors to see about restoring the house so that it could be used as a vacation property we could share with our extended family. The quotes we received were a little high, and so this project has been put on hold for the foreseeable future. I am recently engaged in one of my fiancées to see the property, however, as once we are married, she will be a part owner. It was also important for me to see the property, as it's probably the place I feel most at home. Despite the creepiness at night, the Appalachians feel very comfortable to me, and when I'm on the property, I usually feel very welcome. So this past week, we both took paid time off, and I booked us a cabin to stay near to the property, as our house isn't habitable. We drove up, got to our cabin, and then went up to the property and visited a nearby town for dinner. Once we got back to the cabin, we unpacked our bags as it slowly turned to night. My brain is on vacation mode, and I go over to a window to show my fiancée how dark it gets outside up here compared to where we live. And I open the curtains to show her the pitch black of the woods. I then shut the curtains and joined her on the couch in our living room, and all of a sudden my stomach drops. I forgot the rule about looking out the windows at night. For the first 30-ish minutes after my goof, everything was normal and fine. Then we heard a knock. Not on the door to our cabin, but from above. We muted our TV and listened, but it didn't continue. I joked it was probably the ice maker in the fridge or something, and we went back to watching TV. Then a few minutes later, it happened again. My fiance once again muted the TV. We listened, it didn't continue, and we went back to watching TV. This went on for a while. Finally, after hearing it 3 to 4 times, my fiancée said she was going to go try and lay down because this was freaking her out and she was really tired. She stepped into the bedroom and the lamps on either side of the bed flickered. Then she heard 2 knocks, one after the other. The next thing I know, she's brought her pillow and blanket and is joining me on the couch. The knocks continued, spaced maybe 5 to 20 minutes apart from each other for as long as I remember. After my fiancée joined me on the couch, I went and got my pew-pew down on the table beside me. Despite the continued knocking, having it beside me brought me a little bit of comfort, and I was able to doze off eventually. The next morning, the knocking had stopped, and we made a rule not to look out the windows or be outside after dark. The day went by fairly uneventful. We spent most of the time hiking a rather crowded trail, so we didn't get spooked by anything, and heard and saw lots of animals while we were out. Once we were back to the cabin, all seemed calm until my fiancée went to shower. A few minutes into her showering, I heard someone yell, "Hey," from outside her cabinet. Weirdly, the voice didn't sound male or female. It was both high-pitched and also from a low register. I can't describe it well, and when I shared this with my fiancée later, she asked me to try and recreate it, but I generally don't even know how, and I couldn't get close. From what I could tell, no one was staying anywhere around our cabinet that evening, and I didn't dare look out the window again or even through the peephole. I ignored what I heard the best I could and waited till we were driving home to share what I had heard so that my fiancée would be able to sleep that last night. Thank you for sharing your story. Keep sending me your stories and suggestions, guys. Happy Father's Day. Keep Appalachia haunted, y'all.